memory, I just want to introduce myself.
Live streaming is on.
I want to introduce myself so that you can kind of understand my perspective and understand why I'm talking about things the way I do. So I'm 22 years old. I grew up in a little village in Switzerland, but also traveling a lot. And now I just finished my bachelor's degree in architecture, not urban design. So more design focused and concept based. And now I am looking forward to doing an internship with Rudy and Vera at Civic City. And this project happened during a studio semester with Professor Hubert Kumpner, who is one of the founders of the urban think tank. So during the semester, we went on a seminar to Sarajevo. And on the first or second day, I discovered this beautiful courtyard. And I was quite fascinated by the contrast of the beautiful garden and the fallen statue of kind of this strong Tito figure and the decaying architecture in the background, and this clear surfaces and the bullet holes that were still in the facade of the building. But I was so intrigued by the space, and I really wanted to know what had happened to it, or why it was devastated and no one was really there. So this courtyard is located in what is today called the Historical Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was built in the 1950s by Boric Mogoš, which is a Croatian architect. And when it was built, it was actually called the Museum of the Revolution. And as you can see, it embodies that beautiful Mies van der Rohe, simple structures, the cubism, and it has these beautiful contrasts, which are now kind of hard to detect because the facade is all broken up and what do I know. But the spaces are really beautiful, and there are very interesting exhibitions in there, and then they're all really oriented towards that garden. But the thing is that the museum is extremely expensive for Bosnians. If you compare it to Swiss salaries, it will cost 36 Swiss francs or euros to enter a rather small museum. So it's a very interesting place. To kind of understand how that building came to be built in Sarajevo, I just want to quickly talk about how Sarajevo developed as a city. So Sarajevo lays in a valley, which is kind of that long line. And it developed from east to west. So it first started under Ottoman reign. So the city center has this really beautiful wooden little houses and those intricate Muslim homes. And then in a second step, the Austro-Hungarian Empire took over Sarajevo, where you then have kind of that Vienna style Blockrandbauten, those Vienna temples almost, these villas. And then after Sarajevo became socialist, you had all these socialist projects by architects like Neidhardt, where you had these huge projects with thousands and thousands of inhabitants in a socialist style. And now after the war...
And you forget the German invasion.
Yes, well, exactly. Yeah. So between the Austro-Hungarian and the socialists and exactly, there's German invasion. And then under Tito, they countered the Germans, or they kind of celebrate their victory, which is also why Tito was able to kind of unify Yugoslavia under his name and under that socialist regime. It's more kind of like an architectural history, just for the sake of understanding how the city is built. And now today we have a very interesting contemporary architecture, which a lot of Sarajevans are actually quite proud of. And it's this special mix of kind of modernism and then kind of the glass skyscrapers with like a hint of brutalism. It's very interesting, but that's now scattered all throughout the city. And this little rectangle that you see is the neighborhood of Morin Dvor, where the museum district lies and where the project is really focused on. So in Marin Dvor itself, we have a very interesting situation because it's kind of the cut between the Austro-Hungarian architecture and then the socialist architecture. So you have these typical Austro-Hungarian buildings, which were built during the 19th century. And then you have the socialist projects, which were built during the 20th century. And then the kind of post-war buildings like the US Embassy, which have a very strong sense of kind of capitalism, political power, and they're quite aggressive and don't really match the feel of the socialists and the kind of older architecture that is there. So 30 years after the historical museum was built, the Yugoslav war started in 1989. As we all know, a lot of the socialist regimes broke down. And with that, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and many other countries kind of fell apart or fell from Yugoslavia into that patchwork. And it became a very brutal situation. And here again, I just want to point out that before I started this project, I didn't have an in-depth knowledge of the war. And still today, I have a very Bosnian even perspective, I think, on it, because I only interacted with Sarajevans when talking about the war, mainly 5 young women who study architecture at the University of Sarajevo, and they were all Bosnian Muslim. So that's kind of what I'm going to focus on for the sake of that project. But I think it's important to know that that history is so complex and disputed that nothing really is factual, which I think kind of ties into that sense of knowing and not knowing. There's really no knowing, there. But I think this story is a story about a city and how a city went through that war and how that city can kind of manage to work through that. So the Yugoslav wars lasted from 1991 to 1995. And Sarajevo during that time was completely besieged. The siege of Sarajevo is actually the longest siege in modern history and lasted over 1,400 days, from 1999 until after the peace agreement in 1996. And it is really remarkable what happened in Sarajevo. Over 10,000 civilians were gunned down by snipers and by shellings, over 1,600 children. So it is horrifying. But it is also remarkable how much stamina there was, not only in a survival sense, but that Sarajevans held on so tightly to their heritage, because Sarajevo had always been an epicenter for culture, for mixture, for art, for filmmaking, for music, and that really didn't break down during the siege. This is a picture by a photographer called Paul Lowe, and it's a concert that took place in a bombed library during the siege. The historical museum, this is the courtyard that I showed you before, was one of the museums which stayed open every single day during the war. So they didn't close down. They kept having cultural events, even though these towers that you see in the background were sniper towers. So they were occupied by Serbian snipers. And whoever went to the museum was at risk of being gunned down, and the museum still stayed open. And I find that extremely remarkable. And I think that's also the sense that you get when you enter that courtyard. You can sense that there is something very, very special about it, more than just the beautiful architecture. It really is kind of this epicenter of history, of resistance, and of culture climbing above war. So to kind of try to capture that war, kind of close that chapter as much as we can. In 1995, the Dayton Peace Agreement, or Dayton Accords, were signed by Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and other states, which brought peace. But today we might see it more as a ceasefire rather than a peace agreement, because the more criticism is being brought up about the Dayton Accords, not excluded to, but also focused on cultural heritage, because out of the 150-page agreement, only 5 pages were talking remotely about culture, which obviously is ridiculous in an area which is so complex and has so many different histories. So the Dayton Accords tried to establish a committee which would last for 5 years and to regulate national monuments and history writing, but it really just failed. I think that's all we need to say about it. It just didn't work. And the result is that no one really has the responsibility over cultural institutions, and it's extremely hard to find someone who will take responsibility, because there's the Serbian part of Bosnia and there's the Bosnian part of Bosnia. And in the political system, there are 3 presidents from all 3 different ethnicities. Everyone has a very different understanding of what happened in the 90s, and there isn't really no consensus. And then comes capitalism, an extreme wave of neoliberalism that crashed Sarajevo after the war, with the Western world, with Europe and the US, trying to capitalize and profit from everything that is there, which just leaves the culture in a hole. You know, no one cares. Everyone's focused on putting in kind of like hard infrastructure, putting in tramways, of course, but no one cares about culture. No one benefits from addressing those topics, which would technically be so relevant in this traumatized, scarred society. And with the cultural institutions breaking down in their purpose, their architecture breaks down, and the public space around them also breaks down. There's no reason for people to get out. People don't see cultural spaces, public spaces as a place where they want to be, because there's insecurity, people are drawn back. And that's how all these beautiful museums and institutions are just falling apart. For example, the Historical Museum used to have 46 employees during the war, during the actual war, and now they're down to 16 employees, and some of them don't even get paid. Additionally to the cultural struggles, there's a very high unemployment rate in Bosnia, with 15%, according to the World Bank. Bosnia is seen as a rather corrupt country, with 2/3 of the population believing that the political system cannot do anything about the corruption that's happening. And media has been reporting about rising tensions between the Serbian part and the Bosnian Muslim part, which again is an element where you would think, well, if we start talking about history more openly, and if we have institutions who can educate people, then maybe those tensions would kind of be clarified and you could find common ground, but that is not happening at all. And then there's the resignation of the young people, which I find quite hard. You now have a generation of young people who either were born during the war or grew up as little children. So if you imagine if you were born in 1995, you're probably now still at university, and you were born during the siege, if you're born in Sarajevo. So it's a young history, but those students, they just don't feel empowered to do anything. So they'll say things like...
I think it's one dimension we have to know. When you go in Sarajevo, you have all the cars who are now not legal in Europa,
Yes.
who are exported from the firms of Germany, France, and Italy there. So these firms don't produce. They export in other place our pollution.
Yeah.
And this is so a scandal. So you is one of the most polluted city because of these cars, not only, but also.
Yeah, it's even more ironical than that. Actually, just outside of Sarajevo, VW, the car company Volkswagen, has one of its biggest productions, and they produce brand new cars right outside of Sarajevo. They are sent to Europe, and once they're broken down, they get sent to Bosnia, where people drive them. So it's like, it's even more ironic. It's bizarre.
And
So-
more is bizarre.
Yeah. So you'll have statements of like young, bright women will say, "We're too poor to care about. We know about it, but we're not privileged enough to truly care." Or they'll fear, understandably so, talking about religion and ethnicities. I had this encounter where some of my colleagues in Sarajevo were talking about religion and ethnicities in a presentation. Rudy, you might have been there. And afterwards, I went and had lunch with some of these women, and one of them said to me, "You know what? I was about to walk out. I don't understand why someone from Zurich just comes here and starts projecting religion and ethnicity on architecture. You have no idea. It has nothing to do with it. We just want to build houses. We don't want to be involved in all of this." So there's such a frustration there, understandably so. And then also just the economical dimension of living in a city where you won't really get paid once you graduate. Obviously leads to educated young people leaving Sarajevo and not really engaging and helping that discourse to go any further. So to now kind of bring my perspective in and change that resignation to hope, I want to just draw a quick comparison. I went to the Kunsthaus Zurich a couple months after being in Sarajevo, and I saw this piece of art by Joseph Beuys, which is basically a bottle of oil. And I remembered seeing it before, and I thought it was funny how it was like this bottle of oil, and then, you know, the glass and kind of the tag and the light and everything looked so perfect. But I actually had seen the same work of art in Sarajevo, where there were like 50 bottles on a table. We could literally walk up, grab I mean, obviously no one did, but just go and grab a bottle. And I thought it was so... Yeah.
Now you have to bring the picture of Zurich to Sarajevo.
Yes, no, we really should. I presented this to one of the professors from Sarajevo, and he loved it so much. It just shows, you know, how kind of frozen cities like Zurich are, and how much potential there is in Sarajevo that we can work with, if only we understand that this has, even just the way it's exhibited, besides the point that it's like 50 times the amount of bottles, has so much more value than this. You know, this is accessible. This belongs to the people. This is very interesting. And that's kind of the perspective I want people to take when talking about Sarajevo's extremely complex and traumatizing history. Sarajevo is also becoming more and more relevant in Europe and for Europe, with the airport in Sarajevo having 60% the amounts of flights. This is pre-COVID stats, so 60% the amount of flights as years before, being part of railway initiatives, of highway initiatives all over Europe. And then within Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is a map of all the national monuments and the number of national monuments per city. And as you can see, Sarajevo is unmatched within Bosnia and Herzegovina regarding its density in historical knowledge and preservation. And then inside of Sarajevo, there's also this kind of epicenter of what we in our studio called immaterial generating, which includes schools, includes culture institutions, museums, forums, all that. And that's that green part. And then Marin Dvor and the museum quarter lies within that square. And then, as I've showed before, Marin Dvor in itself has this huge variety of buildings and times clashing, and the history of the war and all of that. So to jump to the project, I just tried as an initial approach to find all the open public spaces which could, with a little input, be transformed into not just public spaces, but really space for the people. So the idea was to start with the museums as institutions to carry that knowledge, make them more accessible, and bring the knowledge from the museum onto the streets of Sarajevo. The initial architectural intervention started with a simple incision. So what you see here is the floor plan of the historical museum. The green is the garden area with the walkways, and then on the right is the built part. Is on the bottom. You can't read. I can't even read it.
The restaurant's name Tito.
Yeah, Tito Cafe.
And it's fantastic.
It's this. This is Tito Cafe.
I think 50% of the time I was in.
Yeah, same. And the beer is very affordable. And the bathrooms are fun too. So the idea was to just break open. This is a gate, which is just closed off. So just opening, like physically opening the gate. And then here, breaking down a couple of meters of that thick wall of the pedestal that cuts the public out from the garden, and open up the garden to the public, not the museum, because I understand that they have to have an entrance fee, but open up the museum to the garden to the public. And then, as a more kind of design gesture, implement a line, something to highlight, something to kind of bring forward the meaning and just capture people's attention a little bit, maybe even just temporarily. And I went with this very simple gesture of these formwork panels, which would just guide people and make people curious to enter that museum garden. And then on an urban scale, drag that gesture into the urban, into the open, into the public, to lead people towards the museum, and also have reminders throughout Marin Dvor that the museums are so relevant and that collective space is so relevant. And out of Bosnian formwork panels, so produced in Bosnia, I built the prototype for my model, and I think it's the best decision I made for the project, because I just built it and I put it somewhere and no one knew whose it was or what it was. And people automatically started interacting with it, sitting on it, working on it, reading on it, kind of standing around it, gathering around it. I mean, we were so attracted to it, which I thought was so interesting.
So that's the dimension of the outside.
Mm-hmm.
What we see here is a cut of this.
Exactly. So that would be kind of like a corner, like so.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And then, so this was all last fall. And then this summer, I started collaborating with Hamdia Kocic, who is Bosnian, who had to flee from the war and moved to Zurich in the 1990s. And now is part of an organization called Matica Bosnia, which tries to introduce more culture back to Sarajevo and protect the culture in Sarajevo from Zurich. And then Radial, who are the producers from the formwork panels that I built the model out of, actually agreed to sponsor the material. And then obviously myself, a student. And collaborating with Radial and Hamdia brought this huge network of people who we have to try to win over, convince, including the canton and the city of Sarajevo, who are politicians who struggle with taking sides in history, kind of working with the museums. And then the SECO, the Swiss Department for Economic Development, which is solely interested in economic progress, which led to a development of the project, which I find quite critical, but I want to talk about it. And and has now turned the project into an advertisement for Bosnian wood production. So Bosnia has a great wood production. Over 50% of the surface area is forested. There are 10 million cubic meters of wood growing every year, and only 4 million cubic meters are being used. So there's great potential for sustainable development. Wood production has a long history, kind of anchoring that industry in Bosnia and making it very relevant, not only when it comes to money, but also historically. And Bosnia is very well located, and it can serve almost all of Europe within 24 to 48 truck hours. So kind of now starting from that economic standpoint, we had to reduce the project, kind of pull it away from its historical meaning and focus more on the public qualities, to kind of sell it to the politicians. And while staying in the museum quarters, this is in the middle, you see the National Museum, and then you see parts of the museum quarters. We kind of said, okay, what elements do we need, and then what activities do we have? We try to connect, we try to get people to socialize, we try to get people to relax, but it's kind of lost that narrative of bringing history into the city, at least, and when presented to the city of Sarajevo and Zurich. And then the project has also been diversified, where it's not that connecting line necessarily, but more elements in the city that tell the same story and are more connected visually rather than physically, which I think has potential, but also changes the project quite a bit. So to kind of revise on the development, I think I started my project trying to do as much research as I could without speaking the language, without having a lot of knowledge beforehand. But it was kind of a 3-month research on the history, understanding the trauma, having a very simple design, trying not to dominate the narrative, but just to engage people and get people to think about their own narrative and the city's history. And then adapting this idea of how to talk about what we not know and how to talk about what we can't know in a political context, and actually making it happen in the real world. And that is kind of the end of my inputs, but I also want to pose 2 questions. The first being, how do we as designers and artists weigh the balance between what we want to tell and how we want to project the not known, and how much we compromise to actually implement it? Because I think, especially when we're talking about memory and history, there's usually a reason for why it's not known. There's usually someone who doesn't want it to be known. There's usually a people who are traumatized by what had been known. So how do we balance the radical standpoint that we can take from an outside perspective with the feelings and the complexity of the local dynamics? And then the second is that also, I think as a designer, you always see legitimacy in your own project. But how do we actually quantify our success? When is my project successful? Like, is it just the fact that I thought of it? Is it the fact that it might be implemented? Is it successful when people engage with it? Or is it only successful when people actually start thinking about the memory, right? Like, where do we cut the line, and how do we qualitatively and quantitatively measure success in displaying the unknown?
Thanks a lot. I think it's a very interesting topic, and the way that you ask also challenges is surely very interesting. We can go, come here and try to walk about this problem or this element. My first is not a critic. It's just a little gap in between a graphic designer and architect. For me, the work will start now if you start to make information on this yellow element. And transform a form support to information. And I'm sure this acting will also change the reception of your project. Because now we see, yes, it's very interesting, this line, is it enough? So you are into abstraction of something. Is the line, say the line, this element who interests you, the element of memory, or is this just abstraction of the memory and the sign of the need of a memory?
Yeah.
And I make many competitions about memory in Germany also, memory of the Second War and of different position. I like the position of the persons who was not only contra fascismo, but who was also persons who don't will the war. I think it's very interesting today also to compare it. Is it, can we say, okay, we are more Ukraine side or Rouge side, or did we say it's not possible that a war happen like this, and how can we do that the war don't happen? So there are three positions in the fact, in the end. And I literally could be. Yeah, and in this competition, I was often in concurrence with artists. And what I see often is that the artists try to make the symbols, but without saying the symbols. So it's three-time codification, and at the end, don't stress the fact. Huh?
Yeah.
And for me, how can we really and I like, because you asked this, what was the end of your expose? You asked, when did I be success? I think you will be success is at the moment who you can take at this place the history. But probably history in a very complex way, history with questions, history because many things in this war are not clear, as not. So I think you cannot enter in this history only with this was points. Directly you cannot. You can make history of the mediatization of the war. This will be very interesting to say, okay, we speak differently in different part of the world about this place. This give one aspect, but you can also make a history who is based on questions, who is very strong, because this means that the person has to construct her own history, her own. I have one example who do this for a prison, and this give also the possibility, I think, a little bit more to be in between positions. Huh?
Yeah.
To say, I just ask. I don't give my definition.
Yeah.
I don't say it wasn't like this. With the question, I can construct something. And I think the line you propose has something very in connection on this, because we start a confrontation with something. The first questions are very simple often, or not, but are very essential. And then you go deeper and deeper, and the questions are changing, and the way to look on this thing are more complex, because also in Sarajevo was different positions, different. It's, and Sarajevo is so complex. I never see. That's a point of what I protect and you protect and others protect is this the diversity. The diversity is not easy. The diversity in moment of conflict come to be yeah, because you are absolutely, it's really the same as we are in between Ukrainian. At one point, we take position for one of the two, and when you do this, you forget a dimension of the problematic.
Yeah.
And how can you stay outside? So in this, it's not ambivalence. In this,
in the not knowing
capacity to see everything when the bombs bomb your home. So it's very difficult, and I think we see it also in the COVID. How when the big history starts to be on our place, this shock in between we and the generality come to be very disoriented.
But I think that this project is really interesting for a lot of effort. But I think that one part of success is also connection, simple connection, because you try to let the person, the woman, the woman and the man, to come into this place and to stay into this place and to connect to the other. So this is the first for me. The idea that this is a place in which you can sit down, you can study, you can read, you can begin to try to connect with the place, but also with the other. And the other is exactly that one that say Luli, because I think that's one of the most interesting effects of the process of design is to try to open question, not only to give solution. No? So the idea of the question, of the very simple question, because obviously we have not the possibility to have a deeper discussion of the thematics that are so complex.
I think it's also interesting to think how the sniper
Exactly.
his head when he shoot on.
Exactly. Exactly. The basic one, no? It is something of very, very simple, but is very powerful because you try to think, you try to want to understand something, because sometimes when you are, I think, because fortunately I am not in a place in which there are war, but I think that sometimes
You have the result of the war.
and I ask what happened, but I don't really want to know what happened. I am so involved with the problem, with the effect of this disaster, that sometimes I don't have the capacity. But not only the capacity, the volunteer or solution.
The will,
The will
yeah.
to understand, because you are so full of problems that the only things that I can understand is that you can do what you want, you can have the life that you want and that you had before, and so on. So I think that we can only try to begin a process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people can be
Stimulated
from this and begin some process that is not fast.
Yeah.
We have to do, we happen to do something that say, yeah, this is the one. Yeah, we have to try to, the things that say out before, kindness, something that is,
I think what you say in this approach perhaps bring us again to questioning if the second proposition to say
second,
I'm more in the context. I'm not only on this
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
It's possibly it's more interesting.
Yeah.
It's possible. But how can we connect both? I think here you have a very interesting gist, and also I think urban intervention, and perhaps they have to expose.
Yeah.
Yeah, we read that. I don't know if you because I go in Sarajevo, but a lot of years ago in the village of war. But is it possible to do something ever less big, less complicated, but sometimes some little sign of this yellow
Yeah.
object in the rest of the city? That is maybe only one question, but in other parts of the city.
And then, sorry, I monopolize a little and make this will be a little bit a harder critic. Is so you say Sarajevo and not Croatia, Bosnia has many. You can do something also for the industry. I think it's very interesting. But is this not the time to introduce perhaps something who is not a code who come from Austria? Yellow element is brilliance. Is coming from. It's very it's connect. Is it global today or not global but European? But it's connected with Austria.
Okay. Why?
Because
I'm just wondering.
the first who do this are Austrian.
Really?
Yeah. This is and Vorarlberg.
Ah, okay.
This was the aesthetic of Vorarlberg who come to be more global. And the idea is how can you, if this work has also a function to promote the industry of how can we make something a little bit special who also connected on this knowledge?
English is not so good. I'm sorry. But I don't think that natural is the word.
Yeah.
Because it is not natural, the approach. It's not aggressive, it's not dominant, but is maybe the only things I think is kindly, but it is not kindly the word, but not. We have to take part, to take a position. Obviously, this is a political action, so we have an opinion. The only things that we have to grow up with the people and not to be dominated to say you are not able to understand nothing and I am the designer and I show you what is the problem. So it is not natural.
Mm-hmm.
I think that design can be not natural.
Yeah, I agree.
Also, Annalisa, you are very far. On the screen, you can answer. Oh, sorry, you are in double. No, I think it's interesting. We open the discussion, Michael. Be careful, I have many to say.
If I may say one thing,
Daniele.
I think that Rem, that you were talking about, right? When you can take the perspective, kind of the outside perspective, and see both sides. I think we also have to make sure that we understand that being able to take that position is a privilege
Yeah, sure.
by the non-affected. It's a privilege I can take because none of my family died in the war, because I wasn't born in the siege. And I think when kind of entering, I think that happened a lot to my colleagues, that it was almost, I don't want to make any Vorwürfe, but I think it was a little bit of the not understanding why people weren't talking about it. And I think when we kind of go in as designers, we have to understand that us being able to not be maybe as emotional or take a different perspective is something we can't expect that people who were so affected by it talk about it in a rush or like in a more objective way.
I'll go speak about Socrates' ambivalence. Socrates' paradox. The paradox of Socrates. And I think you bring it in this question. You bring it a little bit in visibility. An example. If we come from outside and we say and take position, if we take position, we are not neutral and we are kind of colonialist of the knowledge. If we ask, and if we ask the place, we bring the persons who are at this place in the center. They are beside. And we speak a lot these 4 days about the intelligent naivety. Is how can we come to be again not the person who gives the solution, but who generates the solution, who makes that other can be part of the process, who makes that the process and the construction of the history is not a construction who is based on the state, but is based on the people. How can we? And this is fantastic because you do it on place, you do it in a context who's still very fragile, very affected of the point. It's very strong. So how can we? And this is the other point. Questioning this is the point of monumentality. And I often think about, we name it une décennie before, le creux de la ville. There are the posters, 3 to 4 meters. They cry. They have. But we can also make a little etiquette of 1 centimeter to 15, and then is another way to interconnect with the persons. And it's same strong. It's same strong because it's very more near, it's very more in proximity. It's probably also more intimate. So how can we say your approach is not only bulldozer? It can be. You need probably something a little bit strong, and it's not wrong to say this can be in connection with the museum, because this is a function of this museum to work on the history, and they do it very good. They do it in an interesting way. I feel it. So it's interesting to say it's coming from there and perhaps come to be sad. To be how can be the minimal of the intervention, but present.
Yeah.
And how people can integrate. That's surely also a very important point, is how you can say any part of this element is without inscription, without question. How can you bring the question of people and the point of the question coming from other and not only from you?
Yeah.
But sorry, but I think in this way, as designer, you have also the impertinence or this, to say the foreigner who as a designer perhaps see some elements who the other don't see, and he don't has to say it's this, but he can ask a question.
I think about which kind of participation in
Well, that's actually, I think, kind of ties into the second part of the question, is how do you generate that participation, and also how far does the project have to go, or how far does the project generate the participation? So I think when I built the model, what I felt was very interesting is that people were interacting with the model in a very natural way. So the interconnection was not necessarily like a workshop or an event, but it was more kind of a randomly sitting next to each other, kind of at the bus station interconnection, which I think is a very interesting thing that happens in public space. But I'm also very open to criticism regarding how effective that would be. Like, I'm very interested to hear from you. Do you think that makes sense to only have that passive interconnection? Do you see possibilities where maybe there could be an art installation somewhere that adds to it, where people are drawn to and start conversations? Could there be discussion panels? Could it be more engaged maybe with the cultural institution? Because now it's very passive. You know, it's more kind of that interplay.
I don't know what it is at this place. I think we have to work on the context and all this. But I can just say the methodology who say the prototype is a point of starting a discussion. So can say the provocation is a part of the start of a discussion. And I think I don't imagine to say it's nothing.
Yeah.
So it's we need objet relationnel, an object who starts to say okay, because it's not easy to say okay. Each day I stress my office. I'm not in this question. So the start has to be. We need a déclencheur, something who, and this can be the question of the foreigner. I think it's very interesting. The question how you I need the answer or I need new questions.
Yeah.
Everyone has another tool to do it. And the beginning of
I think that's what was always extremely important to me is that the most important thing is for it to be appropriated. I really like that word. It's a bit aggressive, but I love the. If that means people sit on it, I think that's great. If it means people hang their posters on it, I think that's great. You know, I think if people start graffitiing it, that's great. I think there's a fine line between it becoming trash, but it's just important that the interaction stands above the kind of pride of the design. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah, but my experience of too open
Yeah.
system is not so
That's
positive
okay.
because the sprayer is stronger as a person who are more discreet.
Yeah.
So I think you need a little bit to be there. And we make one project in a prison in Lyon, who was also a part of history. And we had calligraphers. We
Yeah.
had persons who kept the element, and we were. And I remember we make this a long weekend, and it's coming a young boy of I think 7, 8, and he asks this question, and it was the best question. I do 3,000 questions we do myself, and this young, can we be happy in prison? Dark. And this takes so essential at all this point of what is a prison, what is persons who read Foucault and who so it's and I think we need this naivety, this poetic of life, but this you cannot find it. This is not a crime. This is not a spy expression. It's something very more intimate, very more dialogue.
I think